Hello, this is video 4.5 because I'm squeezing it in really quickly between video 4 and 5. And this is over population policies. Here you can see here your key concepts and questions and how you should set up your page. I suggest you set up your page like this, like I have, because this is the order that I'm going to go in the notes. And we're going to talk about the differences between antinatalist and pronatalist population policies. And we're also going to talk about the unintended consequences of those population policies. So, a major kind of question surrounding population policies is, how can governments influence their country's population? And the answer is to enact one of these types of policies, either pro-natalist, which is also considered an expansive population policy, and an anti-natalist, which is considered a restrictive population policy. Now, before we go on, think about the words themselves. Natal, N-A-T-A-L, refers to having children, right? So pro-natal means that it's positive towards having children. Anti-natal means negative towards it, right? So let's talk about the two policies themselves. A pro-natalist expansive population policy. What is it? This is when governments want to encourage larger families and increase their birth rates. And the reasons why they would be doing this is because a lot of countries are getting to the point where they're approaching stage 5 in the DTM, where their population is actually declining, right? Or they are at zero population growth. So a government might enact a pro-natalist population policy to start up the population in their country again. Also, it can be good for economic growth. And then some countries, it may seem wild, but they think really far in the future and think the more children we can have, the better army we can have, right? So this is actually one of the reasons why a pro-natalist policy might be enacted. So an anti-natalist is kind of the opposite. This is typically stage 2 countries in the DTM. There's an announcement. This is when there are usually stage 2 countries of the DTM, and these countries want to encourage smaller families and decrease birth rates. So the reasons behind decreasing birth rates are exactly what you would think. There aren't enough resources in the country is going through an economic downturn, overcrowding, high population density, kind of all of these things. The lack of social structure. So let's think about what they can do. So like, what are some examples of pro-natalist population policies? These are down here. So countries can actually ban the sale or use of contraceptives and abortions. So think about it. If a country no longer is able to sell contraceptives to its people, then chances are there are going to be more babies, right? Same thing with abortions. Some countries actually give incentives for having children. So they will pay cash to some parents. There are prizes in some countries, like a car, or some countries give tax breaks for having children. The third thing here is subsidize the cost of childcare and baby items. So some governments will what subsidize means is help pay for, right? So the government will create a system in which child care costs less money for the parents. And baby items like diaper and formula, they could be restricted from taxes or something like that. Those are examples of subsidies. Another way to encourage birth rates and larger families is by requiring long and extended and paid maternity leaves. So I'm going to pop over to the other slide real quick just to show you some stuff about maternity leave. So here are some examples of countries around the world and what they offer for maternity leave. So you can see Estonia and Poland have the longest here on this graph. And what this graph can tell you about pro or antinatalist population policies is that Estonia and Poland, number one, truly value parenthood, motherhood, and encouraging family growth, right? But you can see actually the United States, and we've talked about this previously, does not require paid maternity leave. So United States would be an example of not having a pro-natalist population policy here. But to go back, another example, and the last one here, is free prenatal care and education, right? So if you don't have to pay doctor's bills for being pregnant, or if you don't have to pay as much on your bills after you've had a child, right? These are all ways in which you might be convinced that having a child is actually a pretty good idea. So here's just another example of that maternity leave. I had two graphics here for you. So again, another example is Canada offers 50 weeks of paid maternity leave. So this is a pro-natalist position. So now let's talk about some examples of anti-natalist or restrictive population policies. This is going to be the exact opposite of what we just talked about, right? So instead of banning the sale and use of contraceptives and abortions, an anti-natalist society is going to lower the cost of contraceptives. And it says here, encourage abortion. I don't want you to think that anti-natalist countries are like stoked about abortions. That's not the case. But it becomes a more viable and a more socially acceptable option. Giving larger homes or promotions to people who work for the government and choose not to have children is a documented example of an anti-natalist population policy. If you are compliant with an anti-natalist population policy, the government could give you access to free education and free childcare. So these are both kind of ways to encourage people with a positive outcome, right? However, there are ways to encourage smaller families with negative outcomes. So fines, demotions, or being fired from your job. So specifically, if you violate population policies, so for instance, if there is a one-child policy like there used to be in China, and you have a second child, you are forced to pay a fine to the government. Countries can also, this is supposed to say refuse to register or give papers to children. So if you have broken the population policy, the government can just choose not to issue you a birth certificate. And so this creates a massive issue for those children who are technically against that anti-natalist policy, right? Because they don't have birth certificates. Think about it, in our country, it would be like if we didn't have social security numbers. And then lastly, so in opposite of what I told you over here, instead of subsidizing the cost of child care and baby items, they could increase the cost of that baby stuff. So here's what you need to know about the focus in the 21st century, right? The focus on population here in how to control it is to address broader social issues that cause overpopulation or underpopulation rather than directly targeting the population itself, right? As I was talking through some of these things with you, you might have thought that they were pretty wacky or maybe sometimes like not morally okay to do. And so that's why we've kind of moved in this direction. Instead of trying to restrict how many babies people can have, right? Countries are starting to address those broader issues. So some examples of that would be like to aid a country in their economic development, so to give them foreign aid, to send people to a country to help them have access to prenatal and medical care, contraceptives, etc., or fighting against AIDS and HIV. But here's the main idea, which I've got here on this image and I've got highlighted here. When women are empowered and women are equal, then oftentimes we see, remember, crude birth rate, total fertility rate drop drastically, right? And so the real focus in the 21st century, if we're going to control population, then we need to make sure that women are economically empowered. Okay, so let's talk about some unintended consequences of pro and antinatalist population policies. So some bad things that can come of this. First of all, if it is pro-natalist, people could be having children for the wrong reasons, right? So think about it. If you're getting paid to have children, right, you get a payout or you get a tax incentive, you might not be having children for the right reason. Right. Another example is families who are unable to have children, just fertility-wise, right? So either maybe they're too old or they don't have the same chances of fertility as other people. They can't benefit from those incentives. So it creates some sort of kind of an unfair society. Also, those subsidies that I was talking to you about, they cost the government money, right? So if the government is subsidizing childcare, that means that they are paying money to those childcare services. So that way it is cheaper for the parents themselves to pay for childcare. So this is a huge strain on the government budget. And then also, and I'm sure you can imagine this, if a pro-natalist population policy goes too far, then that can lead to huge, uncontrolled, rapid population growth. Here are some unintended consequences of antinatalist population policies. These are really horrific, folks. So forced sterilization and forced abortions are one example. Now, these might not always be sanctioned by the government, but the government can definitely put pressure on people to do these things. And then society and culture can kind of follow. In some countries that have had antinatalist population policies, we see people abandoning their babies, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about this in class. And we also see sex-selective abortions, meaning that when women and men go to the ultrasound to see if they're having a boy or a girl, if they find out they're having a girl, oftentimes they will have an abortion. Okay, so we actually have a massive amount of boys in countries like India and China because these sex-selective abortions happen so frequently that there are actually missing girls that should have been born that weren't. Another consequence of an antinatalist policy is not meeting a replacement level, right? We talked about the replacement level for total fertility is 2.1. A crisis in elder care, right? So if people aren't having children, then who's going to take care of them when they become elderly? Or if they only have one child, that child is then stifled by having to take care of their elderly parents. Single child syndrome, I think we talked about this as well with our population party regarding parasite singles. These are single children who have kind of been spoiled their whole lives because they didn't have any siblings that they had to share with. And then they go on to live with their parents and never really have a job or have a family of their own. And then lastly, skewed sex ratios, which I was kind of talking about above here when I was talking about sex-selective abortions. This can impact the future because there aren't enough women for men to marry in places like China and India. Overall, folks, important things that you need to know. Let's go back to these objectives. You need to be able to explain antinatalist and pronatalist population policies and the unintended consequences of these policies.